This real-side experience would open up into a situation where I seemed to be in the midst of a very large group of individuals. During the experience, I wasn't really scrutinizing those I was among, just taking it in my stride, you might say. For at the time of its happening, everything seemed to make sense as to what I was doing, where I was going, a little like you might imagine a movie to be, the actors with their pre-designated roles and scripts, and then, just as we may be inserted into the experience, the view open up at a certain point. It would be the equivalent of entering the cinema part way through the movie and then trying to determine what's taking place. Fortunately, we generally have the real awareness impressions, the real awareness that we all are, that is this one everything reality, which is through all consciousness that effects its idea design into all the simulated situations that the personal self can be shown. The real awareness then, with access to the back story, all the ideas that are behind the simulation we are witnessing, that which we may have missed as we entered the cinema late, as our real side view begins part way through the experience. There are occasions, however, where the impressions are absent for various reasons. Sometimes we may simply be standing in the illusions of the idea generating created vehicles, standing as our personal selves, which as we do, we are removed from the position we need to be where we can receive these impressions, that position being the nowness of our real awareness, aside from the consciousness, the ideas we create through the body vehicles. But sometimes, perhaps the back story, the additional information, isn't always necessary, that there is enough visually that what's transpiring can be readily determined, regardless of how late we entered the experience. Generally, I find we enter and leave the experiences at a stage where the experience is well underway, or depart rather abruptly before completion, sometimes departing at frustrating, for the personal self at any rate, moments, at cliffhangers, to use movie terminology, but our view is exactly what we are to be shown at that moment. We may think we need to see this and experience that, but the guides know ultimately what we require at every given moment for our awareness process, what we can handle, what we are ready to see, what would be too overwhelming for us. As an example, we might experience something that elicits a nonsensical reaction with the personal self. We may create unnecessary idea considerations or assumptions in response, more idea baggage to address and purge therefore, and the guides will know this and will cater our experiences precisely that suits each unique individual. Anyway, The large number of individuals I was with were human, at least appearance-wise, as far as I recall. We all appeared to have a destination, or at least a direction, as we all were rather headed the same way, through very large and gleaming white buildings, a little like you might imagine airplane hangars to be, say, that contained nothing other than ourselves. The overriding sense was of the surroundings simply being white, but with a sense of moving through large structures, as I said. There was one young boy who was accompanying me, one that I have no personal self-experience memory of, physical or real aside, but he was remarkably aware, as impressions suggested, and we spoke at great length as we walked with this large group. We covered many topics, everything from the references that pertain to the ears, to the latest dark force skullduggery, as reported by the various researchers and presenters. He would hold Alex Jones in high regard, for example. Interestingly, my sister, Lindsay, was present, and in fact she has been appearing recently in some real side experiences, some of which reveal past lifetime situations we were both involved with, as we tend kick around in creation with the same groups of individuals, lifetime to lifetime, just with the assumption of different decided roles, etc. But additionally, has she been behaving in a way that suggests an intent other than that which she embraces on the physical, that of the general, contented, one-dimensional human? For indeed, intent is always revealed on the real side, and if we encounter those resigning themselves to embracing only and in full agreement with their consciousness, their personal selves, then this is very much exhibited on the real side in behavior that reflects this. Generally, they will represent obstacles and snares, therefore, simply a consciousness of ideas to not necessarily be avoided, but not to be drawn into or agreed with, lest we limit ourselves and indeed be taplined, oftentimes by reptilians, through the consciousness-wallowing individual, as after all, consciousness generally has been manipulated, programmed, as agreement to the dark forces, and so, for those locked into their consciousnesses, they in fact agree to supporting the dark forces, even if not conscious or aware of this, and this will reflect in their behaviors and actions. They are effectively pawns of the dark forces, and as their consciousness is interlaced with the dark forces, so as you agree with these one-dimensional individuals, you are agreeing with that which they are involved with, which would include the dark forces they are in agreement with through the consciousness they cling to. And just as direct agreement with the dark forces has us taplined by them, We also can be taplined by them through agreement with the consciousness embracing individual. But as I said, Lindsay, my sister, had been exhibiting indication that either another, more aware being, maybe even a guide, is adopting her outward form, as guides will assume the forms of our relatives on occasion, or that perhaps she is in actuality becoming more aware in her own right, as after all, despite her disinterest, if she enters my presence on the physical, she will generally have to hear about my latest real side experience, or references in regards to the ears, and so it's likely something of what I have presented her with has nestled, even if subconsciously, and is reflected on the real side, with her accompanying me in certain situations, even the occasional assignment. For indeed, Lindsay will share her dreams with me when she receives them, and her most recent real side experience was of the UK being nuked. Very interesting, considering this as reported by others, myself included, on the real side, that of a global nuclear situations. Further verification I would suggest. But anyway, as this large group and myself, my sister, and the aware boy proceeded, everything would suddenly go completely black, as though someone had turned off the lights. We all would stop moving naturally, and a number would resort to telling a few jokes in relation to the absence of light situation. Humour can be a good coping mechanism in moments of stress, etc. Then the lights would as though be reactivated, and our environment seemed different, still contained within structures of a kind, but not white this time, more a darker grey, and with a sense of foreboding, a certain dark force bouquet, let's say. I would suggest the white of the previous scene may be indicating the isness, as white is very much the colour associated with it, representing a purity, etc., as though this large group and myself were walking symbolically, but literally, into the light of the ears, perhaps, suggesting this large group were on their awareness processes, but something had intervened. The dark forces had as though wormed their way into the process and somewhat redirected us. For of course, no one can derail what we set as our intent unless we allow it. We are the deciders after all. So perhaps we were snared with a dark force idea or other, and as a result, as it is so, that which reflects from ideas, or intent that is changed, even if briefly, must be different experience and circumstances, so the transition from perhaps the white purity of the ears to a more dark force dinginess of positioning resulted accordingly. For with the light restored, with our environment changed, also there would be a number of women secured to one of the walls of the structure we were in, as though crucified, and they would be wearing masks that concealed their faces. And as we looked on, so dark force representatives would hold a gun to each of the women's heads in a turn and execute them before our eyes. This was an intimidating tactic, to be sure, that even though we may have inadvertently agreed with the dark force created idea, as they are masterful at sneaking in their ideas and making them seem beneficial on the surface, and as a result, we were in this new dark force environment consequently, it's very likely, as this large group of individuals seemed to be on their respective awareness processes, that we all would realize our agreement error, make the necessary corrections, maybe intent realigning through the personal self, etc., and resume our ears recognizing a journey and objective. And so perhaps it was prudent for the dark forces to bring intimidation tactics to bear, to attempt to elicit fear with the personal self, as though forfeit your ears journey or suffer the consequences, etc. For indeed, we would exit this large structure to an open environment, and what met our eyes were as though a large series of adjoining interconnected fields, but designated, differentiated into what appeared to be metallic holding areas, like prison fences or pens, and within these were still further humans. Each pen would have its own large group of subdued human. The impressions were that they all were acquiescent to the dark forces, and this situation represented all humans that are locked into a full agreement and immersion with the consciousness, which is agreement to the dark forces, who have ensured consciousness is designed as agreement extended to them, the mechanics that effect a simulator that they desire, that has them as controllers. Interestingly, each pen of humans sported a different colour of attire, as though indicating a difference between these groups, though this difference was never revealed. Perhaps it was the extent of agreement, as some humans are completely, subconsciously, and consciously controlled, others subconsciously, but consciously are bucking the system and resisting, spreading information about the controllers' agendas, etc., but all, however, were contained. As the larger bulk of the consciousness, the subconscious, will be moulded to a controller agreement regardless of a conscious insurrection, and it is this subconscious that needs addressing, releasing, detaching of the ideas it comprises of, and if not, then regardless of one's resistance to the controllers, they are in actuality still in agreement with them, and can never escape the prison cell of what is really of their own design, as the deciders, etc., expressed here with a representation of humanity imprisoned, subdued, in these enclosed pens, but with varying colours of what looked very much like prison garb, denoting what may be then variation in a conscious controller rebuttal, but all retaining subconscious controller agreement. And now it was as though we were to be herded into these pens also. We were surrounded by dark force militia, but interestingly, we had to make the decision, clearly reiterating the reality of how it is only we who can decide our experience through the ideas we create, or ideas as created by others we agree with, and predominantly through our intent placement, etc. The presence of the dark forces is really incidental and irrelevant. The simulation we experience is within our power only to forge. And so, despite the forbidding presence of the heavily armed and armoured military types, we had to make the choice, and indeed, would I suggest to the larger group that we simply walk away from what was effectively an idea we had inadvertently agreed with, to release the agreement, in other words. However, a large number of the group would acquiesce, and with lowered heads would shuffle into the pens, and be designated with the appropriate holding pen and coloured prison jumpsuit accordingly. A far smaller group would establish themselves as those not to be intimidated into agreement with the dark forces, and would accompany me as I somewhat led this exodus from the scene. We found, however, that the only avenue of departure terminated in another fence, but a fencing that would be easy to clamber over, as it was but waist height. Beyond the fencing were a series of fields, separated and bordered with still further fencing that would have to be negotiated also, but again ought not provide much by way of hindrance. However, suddenly a large boar-like animal would charge the first fence we were confronted with, and we would realize this first field contained many of these creatures, and indeed all fields beyond, separated by fencing, housed other creatures, positioned as though as sentries, as deterrents, again an intimidating tactic designed to have the group and myself also tuck tail and enter the human pens. The large boar glaring at us, and all the animal forms in the fields we had to traverse, were not simply animal body types, directly real awareness animated prior to the emergence of the secondary personal self when free will is established, but in fact dark force affiliated beings who were in this form. For I have described in previous real side experiences that the dark forces can assume what are animal beast type forms as a reflection of their poor life choices and awareness limiting intents and actions. However, every personal self, every designed consciousness, no matter how abrasive, still is a creation, and through it will still be this real awareness, which has the singular objective of recognizing the is that it is a part of. And so I approached this boar dark force creature, and as though connected with its real awareness, real being to real being, you might say, as opposed to personal self to personal self, as then you're only dealing with the idea of the individual, the creation side. I was able then to, as though, have the real awareness of this dark force creature, motivate and nudge its personal created self into granting us a safe passage, and thus the group and I were able to jump the first fence and avoid an attempted mauling by this boar and the others of its kind in the field, as though the real awareness of them had got through to the personal selves of each and allowed us to pass. And this was how we proceeded from field to field. We were continuously confronted by various animal, insect-like body forms. All were dark force agents and individuals in these kind of body types that reflected themselves, and with all of them I applied the same tactic, a being to being connection, and met with varying success. For the real awareness is automatically a support for all real awareness, as this is the nature of life, but the extent to which it can get through to the created personal self is another matter, and this would be the situation here, with some allowing us access, like the boars, some attacking us regardless, some partially permitting our progress, etc. For example, we were assailed at one point by a swarm of giant bugs. I almost pitied the dark force individuals whose forms these were, for the choices they had made that had them in such a body type in this experience. Regardless of the extent of resistance, we made it to what was the final field, as it were, as though the releasing of the original idea agreement, which had us in this predicament, took a few moments for us to be extricated from, represented by our transition through the various fields, and a final field that should we exit the perimeter of, so would we be liberated, the agreement released. However, there would be two dark force controllers of a more prominent standing who would unleash more agents. These would be in the form of giant venomous snakes, like vipers, and so immersed in their consciousness were they, the real awareness could not get through to their personal selves at all. These seemed very dangerous, as though especially capable dark force individuals. The group was in a panic, and so I would stand in protection of them, and as the vipers caught up with us, I would as though gather them all in my hands and crush them. They were, however, venomous, as I said, and I succumbed to their toxins, as they had sunk their fangs in and administered their venoms. We were within meters of exiting the final field, releasing the limiting agreement, but my group, although they could have continued on without me, would remain with me instead, as I lay there incapacitated. For now there was as though a shimmering effect around us, and manifesting in the field would be what I can only describe as two dark force beings, but who were somehow infused with technology, and operating within these large mechanical containers. These were dark force characters of repute and standing, the impressions of their lofty positions within the dark force hierarchy, and seemingly they had the power to eliminate us. Evidently agreements still unaddressed, lurking somewhere in the consciousness that gave them this ability, as though we wouldn't agree to containment to join the other humans, and so we were to be dispatched. But then my view somewhat became more expansive, a real awareness view simultaneous to the experience we were involved in, and I would see animals from every corner of the earth as though being motivated to converge on our position. But unlike those we had to bypass, those in the fields who were actually dark force agents, these were animal forms as directly animated by real awareness, prior to the formation of the secondary personal self. In other words, animal forms that will make sense with life, the isness that can be expressed and represented by animals consequently, as no personal self is as yet muddying the waters of the purity of life-supporting beingness. And these isness representing animals would then converge on the field where we were, in the presence of the curious technology-infused dark force controllers, and the animals would stand with us, the group, and myself where I lay. And then two individuals that my real impressions revealed were real guides would also now manifest, and stand with the group, myself, and all the animals. And in the face of this adversity, so the mechanical containers with their dark force controller contents would fade from the scene. And indeed, many of the dark force agents, those who were in animal forms, with their varying degrees of provided assistance, would as though purge what seemed to be curious black metallic fragments from their bodies, as though the guides were assisting them as a result of the assistance they had afforded the group and myself, by ridding them of what seemed to be a means of control in their very bodies. Some technology that had become incorporated with their body forms, that had maintained their acquiescence. They were dark force beings, yes, they had effectively decided this, but had perhaps showed hints and signs of desiring a change in circumstances for themselves, and so had been technologically controlled to ensure their loyalty was retained, but that their real awarenesses had been able to get through to most of them as we traversed the fenced fields that contained them, was a testament to the inability of any control mechanism to hold back anyone who adamantly has a desire to begin to extricate themselves from creation, as this is the fundamental drive that is through all consciousness. This is the real awareness objective, that of is recognition after all. And as everything equals itself, so as they effectively assisted life, allowing us a safe passage, life assisted them. The guides removed their technology controlling implants, which as a result would facilitate better their own processes of awareness if they choose to pursue it, as their free will deciding personal selves were now not so heavily and technologically locked down. For it is the personal self that must decide to align its intent with the real intent of the real awareness. And if the mechanics of the idea and intent generating body vehicles are completely controlled by the dark forces, this presents as rather an obstacle. And there the experience would end. The guides would as though restore my health once again, ridding the viper toxins from my system. Perhaps the toxins represented more than they visually appeared. Some dark force affliction maybe that was very potent, and the group, myself, the guides, and all the animals who came from across the earth to stand with us, proceeded over the final fence, with the dark force animal agents having the option to join us if they desired. The whole environment overall was as though dark force agreement representing, and so it would fall to each respective individual to cross the fence, as it were, to break fully this agreement, or to remain within its confines, as either limited dark force minions, or as penned and locked in humans.
Oh, that was cool, Kevin. Yeah, I could see. I'm sure you've done some, but videos as you're describing this, you use images, giant boars and things like this, etc. It's a good training film for what to look out for, because again, it's created deception, and yes, the five bodies are vulnerable. And so as people become more aware as to how to protect themselves, etc., and what to do. But no, that's great. Yeah, there's a lot to that, but this is the real world. You're seeing it on the real side as they plan all of this and implement it. And then it subtly comes into the, this side here. And it comes in its own particular way, so it comes in very subtly most of the time. But yeah, that's the real impact, and that's hard for the personal self, people to really understand how this first starts. And so just like your computer, what we utilize is the energy in our walls. You guys have 220, we have 110, but if you touch that with your finger, ooh, that's not good. But the computer itself with the images as it comes through, it's very soft. It's all the soft touch, isn't it? But it's part of that creative deception that is the hard part, that's not seen, which you're showing there, as people can learn so much from that. That's really cool. Thank you so much, Kevin.